Good evening, Canby. Welcome to the regular Planning Commission meeting Monday, February 12th, 2024. If you'll join us in the flag salute, we'll get started. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we are going to go into.
I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear anybody, and based on what I see, everybody's muted.
Yep, it says that we're muted.
Are we muted? Nobody can hear me, you just see me? You lucky people.
Oh, bottom left.
All right. He has
Now I
no
can-
idea. Can you hear us now,
Can you
Judy?
hear us now, Judy?
Yeah, whoever had Canby Planning was muted. Thanks.
Thank you, Judy.
Was that a yes? Okay. All right, moving right along. We are going to go to consent items, draft meeting minutes from January 8th, 2024. We've all had a chance to look those over, and any changes or alterations anybody would like to suggest? If not, we'll entertain a motion to.
I was wondering, conditions 4 and 34 both refer to coordinating with Public Works on the installation. And if we ensure that the driveway truly is across the street from the church, Public Works will be able to put in crosswalks there. We have a deficit of crosswalks in that area because we don't have very many ADA intersections and driveways. So if we have the authority to do that, it would benefit the area.
Defer to Dawn on that. Dawn, we have the, is that something we can add to this? It'll be a public works thing, not necessarily something that will hit the applicant.
So Commissioner Ewart and Drosh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Ewart and Driscoll, just a clarification on that. So condition number 4, I'm not sure if that's not already like included in that. I mean, the ADA standards, well, I guess that would be, I mean, there probably would be a crosswalk if that was required. Or is that something separate from that, or?
Well, so right now, there's no requirement to put in a crosswalk.
Hang on just a second. Are we talking about DR 2306?
I believe
The
so.
Trevoli combis?
Yes.
Okay, before we get to that, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. We need to have a motion on the draft minutes, meeting minutes for January 8th.
Oh, I apologize.
Okay, that's first. We'll do that first, then we'll get to the second one, all right? So, somebody like to make a motion that we approve or disapprove or do something?
I move we accept the draft meeting minutes from January 8th, 2024.
We need a second.
I'll second it.
Very good. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Passes 3, 4, 5, 6, 0 on the minutes for January 8th. Okay, now we are going to look at the final findings for DR 2306, PLA 23-05. Tivoli, I can't pronounce that correctly, I'm sure. I apologize. Commons, and we had a question on
Yes, on the,
condition of approval number 4.
either 4 or 34, I'm not sure which it would fit more closely in with. Both of those have to do with the Public Works Department and the access point. If we were able to have the ADA ramps
Okay.
directly across from the Evangelical Church, they would be able to put in crosswalks. If they're offset from that, they wouldn't be able to because they have to be straight across. So if we have the ability to request that they are put in alignment with the entryway across from the church, which it sounds like it kind of already is, but just to codify that.
So the suggestion is to add ADA across from the church and crosswalks at that particular,
Or to align the ADA ramps to be connected by a crosswalk with the church across the street.
Dawn, I'm going to flop that over to you.
I'm just making a note here. Commissioner Driscoll, again, you said to align the ADA ramps. What's the rest of that?
With the opposite side of the street so that crosswalks could be installed.
I'd add that to number 34 rather than number 4,
Okay.
personally.
This makes, and I'm fine with the add, so to align the ADA ramps with the opposite side of the streets, and the next part of that,
So that crosswalks may be installed,
crosswalks may be installed.
and that would be something that Public Works would be doing and signing off on.
And why don't we
everything
say
lines up.
per Public Works standards?
Yeah. And Dan suggested adding that to number 34.
Either 4 or 34.
Okay.
4 speaks specifically to ADA.
Gotcha.
34 doesn't, but it talks about frontage improvements, so I don't know which.
Okay, to align the ADA ramps with the opposite side of the streets, so crosswalks may be installed per Public Works standards. I think we can add that to 34. It'll just cause a small delay. We'll end up having to put this together, and we'll have Matt come down and sign it. Laney, if we could make that change. So I think we can add that to 34.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. How do you want us to go ahead? Do you want us to go ahead and prove it then as submitted with changes suggested and do it that way, Don?
Yeah, let's go ahead with those additions, and and then we'll have Matt come in and sign it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
So if any other discussion? Motion?
I
I
move to
move that we approve
approve.
DR 23-06/PLA 23-05 to Foley Commons
With the changes?
with the changes
Suggested.
just suggested tonight.
Okay. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you, Judy. It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
I just want to clarify, I believe I have to abstain. Is that correct?
Okay,
This was based off of last
okay.
meeting.
You can do that when we get to the vote.
Okay.
Any further discussion? Okay, questions called. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those
Aye.
opposed? So it passes 1, 3, 4, 5, 5 with 1 abstention and 1 absentee. Okay, very good. That takes care of our business that we had on the desk and on the deck tonight. So then we're going to move on to citizen input on non-agenda items. It's an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. I have no one in front of me. I have not been notified that there's anybody on the Zoom side of the world. And so we are going to say there is no citizen input this evening. Item number 4 is new business. I'm showing that we have none. And number 5 is public hearing, and I'm showing that we have none. That will close our public hearing this evening, and we will move into Planning Commission work session. The Planning Commission will meet in a work session to discuss the following topics. Tonight, we're going to talk about housing needs analysis, HNA, and housing efficiency measures update. It's going to be presented by our planning director, Mr. Hardy. And this session will include a review of where we are with the HNA update process and the review of our current residential codes. Okay, Dawn, take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner Ewert. Tonight is going to be a little lighter than some of the other sessions, but also informative in providing some background on our housing and specifically our codes. One revelation in this process of going through the housing efficiency measures is some of our codes should be updated in our residential sections in particular concurrent with the housing efficiency measures. They're kind of integrated to some degree. It will not be a whole-scale code update that we're dealing with, but especially in the R1 and R15 zones. Those in particular need some clarification in some ways, and then in some ways I'm anticipating some changes in those as well as we move forward with that. So tonight we'll be covering a few items, if I can get the screen to... A few items. So I'm going to give you an update on the housing needs assessment and kind of our current work that we're doing with Department of Land Conservation and Development. We'll talk a little bit about cottage cluster and PUD revisions to the C2 commercial zone code updates in light of where we're going to be going, where we're going to be coming back with those. The focus really is going to be on the R1 and R15 zones tonight. Then I will spend a little time on House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458. Those are the two pieces of legislation already passed, those are a couple years ago, that allow housing types where the state, basically, we really don't have any control over these housing types, but they're proposed as a way of providing more affordable housing. And then I'll talk about additional items that we'll be dealing with at the next Planning Commission work session on February 26th. So the housing needs analysis, I wanted to give you an update on this. This will be coming before the Planning Commission for recommendation along with the housing production strategies. When we first started this process, I was not aware of how granular this buildable lands analysis process was going to, what it was going to entail. And we're really in another round of discussion with Department of Land Conservation and Development on specifically, the most targeted discussion is on partially vacant land. And this has to do with the assumptions. What are the assumptions? What should the assumptions be on partially vacant land and the conversion of partially vacant land over the next 20 years? Vacant land is assumed to be absorbed over the next 20 years that's in the city. Partially vacant land is much more difficult to quantify. Sometimes you have situations where you have a house in the middle of a property that makes it almost impossible to develop around it. And then in other cases, there are other challenges that relate to that. So this methodology is still being really reviewed and refined with Department of Land Conservation and Development. Surprisingly, there are not a lot of jurisdictions that have really kind of gone outside of the parameters of the guidelines that have historically been used, but we're peeling that back. We're looking at several jurisdictions that have done updates recently. One is Medford, and in terms of what they've done in their process, which I think will be helpful, and that has been through the entire process. We'll have updates at the next Planning Commission work session on February 26th. I'm hoping that we have, specific clarity. What this all means is how much acreage will there be a need for residentially for urban growth boundary expansion over the next 20 years? That's really the question that this all comes down to. So these are going to be items that are going to take a little bit of a pause until we get this sorted with Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'd like to also come back to the council, city council. It may be a joint session with the Planning Commission. I've not quite figured that out, but on both housing needs and housing production strategies, and on housing production strategies, we also need to come back and address a number of other items dealing with housing incomes, and also housing variety for the entire spectrum from elderly to disabled to disadvantaged. That needs to be addressed along with strategies that would even address things like homelessness. Not that we would build facilities, but what are we doing to help make that less of an issue? And that could be things aspirationally, like working with Canby Center. The library has some initiatives as well that with Clackamas County on training and those kinds of things, and supporting those activities for people to kind of get back on their feet. So that's the housing needs analysis. And so my general prediction is that we'll probably be back into hearing discussion probably in April is my guess, with a work session with council in March is my, and again, this is more to come on this. There's, we're kind of peeling the layers back, as I mentioned, and I'm hoping that this pause will actually help, in being able to, in the work session, really help people understand this. So if we end up with very little urban growth boundary expansion for residential, so that's well understood based on these methodologies. I'm not saying that's where that's going, but that could be the outcome. One scenario is there may not be much residential land expansion. So just full disclosure on that. Thank you, Lainey. And housing efficiency measures, again, I kind of covered this before, that we're taking a little bit of a pause on the housing efficiency measures, and tonight is one of those pauses. And this is really hoping to set the stage for what does the current code allow, and just being very specific about that. And then when we come back with housing efficiency measures, probably also on a similar time frame to the housing needs analysis, probably March or April, coming back to the Planning Commission with both the efficiency measures as well as some more cleaned up code that I think will parallel that process. So I'm going to dive into the R1 zone, and this is, again, just supposed to be an educational overview, but I'm absolutely happy to have discussions around this. But I just wanted to point out some of the elements of our current code, and then also some of the elements of our current code that are just not well defined. And I think that's another part of the cleanup piece of this. And the R1 low density residential code, 7 to 10,000 square foot lots are the range that we see. You can have as small as a 6,000 square foot lot as long as you meet the 7,000 square foot overall density. So the there is an alternative lot layout process, and I think we, yeah, here it is. So the alternative lot layout process, and not to be confusing at all, but there's a section in our code that addresses alternative lot layout, which allows exceptions in the R1 zone to allow lots down to 5,000 square feet. Again, maximum densities factored on 7,000 square foot lots. So basically the R1 zone allows 6 dwelling units per acre, does not permit townhomes, and there's a maximum of 60% impervious surface. I think the alternative lot layout piece of this, yeah, we're going to get to that in a couple slides here, but I will go through that in terms of that exception of allowing for smaller lot sizes in the R1 zone. But traditional subdivisions, if somebody comes in and did not do an alternative lot layout, you're going to see lots between 7,000 and 10,000 square feet. The lots can be as small as 6,000 square feet. The average has to be 7,000 square feet overall, and essentially it's 6 dwelling units an acre, even though the code doesn't quite say it's in that direct of a fashion. If you do the math, it's 43,560 is the square footage of an acre. So 43,560 divided by 7 is really roughly, you get about 6 dwelling units per acre for that. Any questions on R1 as I move forward on these? I'm going to continue otherwise.
Where is the alternative lot layout?
It's 2 slides away, and I'm sorry, I was like looking at this thinking, why did I
No, I was
put
just
this
curious
in
what part of the
early?
code-
But
what are you
like,
talking
that's my, but I'll be 2 slides, bear with me, and we'll get into that in 2 slides. Okay, the next slide is R15. That's a medium density residential, and that permits homes on minimum 5,000 square feet and a maximum lot size of 6,500. It permits townhomes on 3,000 square foot lot sizes. It has a minimum dwelling unit of 6 dwelling units an acre and a maximum of 13. It permits duplexes and triplexes and 4plexes as a conditional use permit. And it permits groupings of up to 3 dwelling units that would be 3 dwellings that would be attached. It allows maximum 70% impervious surface. So now to the alternative lot layout. So this is in the R1 and R15, both zones. If you use this process and it's a deviation from the lot size and dimensions and setbacks in the base zone, it does require interconnected open space or natural areas. Maximum density allowed is what is permitted in the base zone, so you're still subject to the base zone, but you're allowed to deviate the lot size and setbacks. And to the maximum extent possible, open space and natural area shall be continuous and interconnected and concentrated in large usable areas. So this is not used that much in our subdivision process. We've seen it used a little bit, but this is in our code currently. I guess this leads us to the next, if I could continue in the slides, and then this is kind of leading somewhere on usable open space, which is part of what we've been talking about in other formats and hearings, but I'm moving in that direction. So the next slide, Lainey, please, is planning unit developments. And planning unit developments permit attached and detached townhomes, and this would be in R1 and R15. So if you do a PUD, you can have townhomes. It requires 15% gross area to be devoted open space, permits up to 15% density bonus, but limits the underlying base zone density, which means you can't exceed that. So in reality, a developer gives up 15% of the land without the ability to develop that land. If you do the math, you really can't get the density, and so there's some problems with the PUD, thus it hasn't been used probably in, I'm just guessing, I have not seen anything come in. I don't know of any developments that have happened in the recent period of time, and I'm guessing it's because it doesn't really achieve the ability to actually capture what you give up in terms of, open space area, unless you were just trying to do more open space on your project and didn't care about, maintaining the density. And so the critical part I thought that would be helpful for tonight's discussion is moving into open space. And it's as part of the PUD process, open space is to be a common area or dedicated to the public, but usable open space is not defined. So that's a topic that I thought we would go into a little further. Next slide, please, Lainey. And so this is draft usable open space definition for PUDs. This is something we have, when we met on housing efficiency measures, this was the draft definition that was developed that we had talked about. This is several months ago. But open space areas shall be planned and improved to provide opportunities for active recreation, passive relaxation, or community interaction, and which are accessible to the general public or to the residents, employees, or customers in common. Examples include plazas, courtyards, private parks, sport fields and courts, viewpoints overlooking natural resource areas. So what I wanted to do tonight is on the plan unit development, in addition to kind of just overall kind of educational process, I thought it would be important to talk about this usable concept of open space and kind of what that means as part of that process. And the other part, I guess, going back to the PUD piece, is if that were to be something that we were in agreement with and defining, would there be some thought of flexing the plan unit development standards to allow the density to be made up for that you're losing by dedicating that somewhere else on a piece of property? Those are the two pieces. So like kind of hand in hand, if we get something and actually it does achieve all these things, in return, it feels like, and I'm not sure if we would end up getting anybody to ever do PUDs unless we did something like that, because I just think the market on land is so valuable. It'd be yesteryear, maybe people weren't as focused on that, but it just feels like if we don't make a change in the PUD process to allow that density to be recaptured and you're still maxed out on your base zone density, that you're not going to be able to, achieve success, I don't think, in that process.
Okay, so I guess that moving in your question to us as a commission, Could we possibly use the last thing that we just approved? Wouldn't that be a good example?
And that's another kind of segue, because what's ironic about that last project is condominiums I'm not sure why they were baked into the planned unit development ordinance. That was a revelation during the hearing, and again, that's unusual. If that was an apartment project, that conversation would have never happened. There would be no standard. So like, that's another item altogether, and so that's a really good point. So maybe there's the PUD piece, and then there's the condominium piece, and I do feel like they need to be scalable, or you're never going to have any condominiums either. I mean, if you get really extreme on this stuff, people are going to build apartments. They're going to go the easiest path, which I'm not sure if that's really where we want to go as a community. I mean, you're dealing with a problem of fee ownership, people not being able to afford housing. Renting is an issue. It is. I mean, across the spectrum. But I think a large focus of the goal is to get people to be able to afford housing.
Right.
And that may be condominiums. So I think that helps the city by providing the ownership. We obviously need to look at the full spectrum, and the renting piece is important too. But that's a really good point, Commissioner Ewart, is that last project was being looked at. And you guys did have some comments about what is usable, and I guess what my lens on that would be, I'd like to maybe on the condominium side of things, are there attributes that might be different though between a planned unit development where you're doing, let's say you're doing 30 homes versus, that's quite a bit more acreage likely than you are doing 30 condominiums. So just what are those usable attributes that might be different between the two? Because I don't think they should be married into the same code. I think it's unequitable, and I feel like no one is ever going to do a condominium if you can't, make that work. They're going to just put an apartment in.
Okay, all right. So, thoughts?
With apartments, there is a open space requirement of 150 square feet per unit. So they'd have to have something. It's not the same scale, but it's not nothing.
I would say it's less than the condominium standard, though. I mean, I feel like that, I think part of it was back in the day when that was created, and like people did condos with golf courses, and you automatically were there. But if you're not doing it with something associated with that, it's much more difficult, because the space is just not there, I don't think, you might have some circumstances where you have a condo and you have large open space, but I think historically they were much more associated with that kind of activity.
I don't know, the project that is in the, I don't know the name of it, we call it the Honda pits down
Yep.
below the post office down there towards the police station. Now, I don't know whether that would be considered condominiums. That's a combination of single unit and duplex.
They look like they could be condos. I'm not sure what the product is there. Yeah.
Now, we've got a playground.
Yeah,
that
two of
was
them.
in that. We've got a basketball court or two that's up on the upper level up in there. So they seem to be able to achieve that. I don't know whether it was just in their design or whether it was in
The requirements from
it was
us.
in the
Yeah, who
code that
knows?
they had to have that much to do that. So
That may have been one of the
I think they're
last.
Darcy
yeah.
Estates is the official name of that one. Darcy Estates.
Darcy Estates.
Yeah, I don't know how long ago they went in, but it's probably in the last decade.
is that what that's called down there, Darcy Estates? Okay,
Yeah.
very good. I should
And
know
I-
that,
and I
but
can-
I can't never remember.
We're going to continue. Yeah, we can continue that, but it'd be interesting. I'm personally interested in like how far back, because you have to go back a ways to like even see how some of these things were implemented.
Yeah, I'd be really
Yes.
curious to know, because they do
Yeah.
have so much park space, kind of baked into that one.
Well, we seem to have accomplished it with that particular.
Yeah, I know it worked well, and I think again, going back in time though, the circumstances have so much changed. They just are. I mean,
Could it be an SDC park or something like that, or?
that I would need to dig into it, but I mean, we're going to have another discussion on February 26th anyway, so I'll bring that back.
Well, that would
but
just
yeah.
be a good example,
Yeah.
I think, of what you're trying to get to. I just don't know whether they did it because that's what the code recommended or required of them, or if they just wanted to do a nice thing.
No, and I can't answer that, but I'd be happy to dive into it.
From what you're saying, it wasn't the code required it. But then again, I
Well,
don't.
if they were condos, it may very well have been if that code existed, because that's the same thing we had at the last hearing, which is, it's like, whoa, this is kind of crazy to have a PUD open space code that also applies to a condominium project verbatim. I mean, and it was so poorly worded, like you had to read it like 5 times to say, oh, they are connected. I mean, and I was like at the hearing, like, because I hadn't like spent as much time as the other staff members on this, and like, does this even apply? And like, it did, and it was clear, but it was also very like vague about, like, it wasn't even in the same section. It referred to another section that said, it was the title of that section talked about both PUDs and condominiums, and that was a tie-in. But, yeah.
So if I'm hearing you right, what you would like to have is a code that gives a specific call out for apartments and for condos, for open space, that type of thing.
And I think really what I'd like, I think the condos and the PUDs are both really good examples. And tonight, I don't really not necessarily want to dive into it. A slightly different example will be cottage clusters. They're not going to be the same. So I'm not expecting this open space, definition that we're talking about tonight. You're still going to have things for cottage clusters, but there's a different environment there. And we had a definition that we came up with, and we provided this to the Planning Commission when we met last on efficiency measures, which was a single continuous common area for use by residents of a cottage cluster pursuant to the standards of the chapter. And the chapter had a lot of details about that, and I kind of want to push aside for right now the cottage clusters, because we're going to come back and show some detailed examples of those. But the PUDs in particular, which is another efficiency measure, is really, that's the target here. I'd like to encourage the use of PUDs. I'd like the density transfer to be able to be used. I just don't think you're going to get, I think there's nothing wrong with using a PUD. It's already allows attached product, but you're never going to get attached townhomes which would be great in the transfer of density, in my opinion. That might work in some particular area of a PUD as a whole. I don't think you're going to get that without that flexibility. I think that flexibility needs to be given in context of what are we getting from that? Is it usable? And so, like, it's really more the residents that are there, but it also is an established community. We're creating community with the open space piece as well. And it may end up being public. Now, I doubt, the one thing about park dedication, it's probably very unlikely. We have it baked into our code, unless it's along the Emerald Necklace. The city probably is, the Parks Advisory Board is pretty much not wanting to like take additional small pocket parks. It just doesn't benefit the city necessarily versus large, more planned out parks. But the Emerald Necklace is an exception. Having that all connected all the way around the city is really important. So projects that go along the Emerald Necklace, we clearly want the property owners to dedicate that property because we want that continuous feel, and that's a goal for 20 years for the city. But I think part of this is I'm assuming that the PUDs will likely be private owned versus like, hey, we're going to get traffic, we're going to get park impact fee credits. I'm believing that they will probably end up just doing that, and that won't be dedicated to the city.
Okay. Other direction for the planning director to take this?
Yeah, something I'd like to consider for this draft usable open space definition is specific exclusions, such as if you have a tiny little stretch of grass along a driveway, like a public driveway, like the entranceway into a parking lot, a tiny little postage stamp block between 2 units that are going to be sold to individual people. That, to me, shouldn't be considered open space because it's not publicly used. If you have a tiny little stretch of land between 2 buildings and everybody owns these buildings and these individual units, you're not going to have your kids go from your building A over to their building G and hang out in that tiny little 5-foot space between somebody's house. They'd be like, what are you doing over here? Same thing if they were playing in that tiny little square in front of somebody else's house. Like, why are you here? It's not public space at that point. The tiny little stretches along the driveways. My concern for those poor folks in Tivoli Commons is what was being described as the play space with trees. Well, first of all, you can't throw a ball with a bunch of trees in the way. And realistically, on the other side of parking, and it's going to be used as like a dog run. There's going to be poop everywhere. I mean, that's something that I would like to consider in some of these things too, because if we're talking about R2 density, like we were with that specific project, they could have met the density requirement and the open space requirement. They had 2 more units in there that were basically bonus to them that could have been allocated to common open space. It wasn't, but it could have worked. If the numbers don't crunch for R1 and a 1.5, that's, something to consider. But I'm mostly concerned about making sure that that open common space is actually usable, and it's not like throwaway tiny little dots of grass that we're giving anybody credit for, because that's not truly benefiting anybody. It's landscaping.
So you're saying that possibly, and I'm just throwing this out here, that to be considered an open space, it would need to be over a certain square footage inside continuous.
Yeah, either we're saying that it's a continuous, or that we specifically say tiny, we could say it nicer than this, but tiny little spots in front of your unit isn't common open space. The 3-foot berm of grass along the driveway into these units, not common open space. Just something that clarifies a little bit more what does not count as well as what does.
And would there, Commissioner Driscoll, the definition we have up there, is that, what would you add to that? I mean, I know what you're saying, and that maybe that, there's several layers here, and some of this almost gets into like the level of detail of what the physical improvements we want to see in there. But I'm just, as a concept, is there something missing from this that you would want added in this language?
Like, I like that we have a bullet point that says, this is what we're aiming for, and here are some examples. I think just a second bullet that says, open space areas are not X, Y, and Z. And if we, examples are X, Y, and Z.
Could we say something instead of not, could we say open space areas should be, the other language you use, which would be, continuous, I guess part of that is, we could come back with some more language, but I'm trying to get some themes here.
Yeah, if we have to keep it in a positive, then it's like it has to be a continuous space with no less than X amount wide or X amount deep.
Centrally located.
Centrally located, not specifically adjacent to individual homes that a reasonable person would not expect to be a public use space. Although a reasonable expectation is not language we can use. That is not LUBA proof, but.
Okay.
And it's in the thought of thinking what LUBA would or wouldn't approve of that I would think that we would want to call out specific exclusions, because then it's less ambiguous than, but maybe it's not. Maybe we just need to say it has to be at least so wide or so deep and so many square feet at a minimum.
And I think what I would want to do is come back with 2 definitions, one for PUDs in specific, because I do think they need to be different. And I think there can be a little more relaxation on the R1 and R15, because I think that's more quantifiable. And I don't think you're going to end up having the situation where shoehorning is happening quite as much as you are in R2.
Yeah, and I'm worried about the R2 folks, because when we're looking at the cost of housing,
Yeah.
those condominiums are going to sell between $400,000 and $450,000, like easily. And realistically, that means that those homeowners are going to be paying about $3,500 a month for their mortgage. And when you look at the numbers of what people make, we're saying on average people make $88,000 in Clackamas County. We're making $150,000 when we were approved for a $450,000 max loan. And we ended up taking a $375,000 loan, and it was $2,350, which these days would be another $1,000 because the interest rates have doubled. And then, more than $375,000, add some more, and that's where I'm getting my $3,500 number from. But what I'm saying is, these, like, a developer wants you to believe that somebody who is retiring is going to move into these places. Like, no reasonable retiree buys a 2-story home with no bedroom on the main floor. Like, that's not a practical choice for most people. Will somebody do it? Sure, somebody will. Is there somebody out there who has a really lucrative job who is going to choose to live there on their own? Somebody out there, possibly. But the vast majority of people are going to be 2-income families busting their butts to afford something, who are going to be crammed into these little 1,300 square foot houses with 2 bedrooms, no storage inside, and a garage that they basically have to use for their car if they want to have 2 cars to get to work. And when I look at all of that, complicated by there's no open space, like, that concerns me about just like quality of life for people who are already just going above and beyond just to have a place. And then they don't have really any relaxation space. They don't have a backyard. They've got a tiny little paved spot in the backyard. If they do have a pet, where are they going to walk it? In what's supposed to be a recreational area for the kids. It's like all of that just kind of snowballs into a really unfortunate, quality of life and living situation, which ultimately kind of brings down the quality of life for everybody in our community. And so I'm not saying like we don't want housing, clearly we do, but us taking that step of making some actual like usable green space and reasonable parking where we can more accessible really does like change the whole experience of anybody who's moving in.
Well, and the Parks Department in the past have had to put their foot down about people donating square footage, that was of an irregular shape or of an extreme slope and really wasn't useful as a park space. And so, I was just looking now, trying to think of if there was some fancy method of calculating perimeter versus surface area to define a shape that's, more round than oblong, or something. I couldn't find something like that, and I'm having a hard time figuring out how we could do this without getting too far down into the weeds and having staff, saying, essentially arbitrarily saying, what this space could be used for and what it can't be.
I think maybe overarching all this is, in the last hearing process, we had they did a lot of work, but I don't think they fully articulated their alternatives that they were, which gets back to your point. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, in particular in R2, you have to have 14 dwelling units an acre as a minimum. So there are basis of design parameters around that limit this. What I'd like to see is applicants, when we get into that situation, we can't create a code that makes it impossible to do 14 dwelling units an acre in R2. That will never be acceptable, and we can't arbitrarily change that number either. There's, between the state and private property owner rights, that's not going to happen. But I think what we can do is get into more of this, what were the alternatives that you considered? What was the basis of design of those alternatives? And get into that level, which I think starts to tease out the best option. And sometimes the best option may not be because the density drives it. It may not necessarily still get us there, but it's better.
Okay, anything?
I guess when I look at that last development, when you guys look at this as a planning department, do you look at this thing at 30,000 feet and look at the stuff that's around it and think about, what's this going to look like, 20 years down the road? That was my problem, trying to envision this monstrosity in the middle of these homes. How's that really going to? And then I think, are we putting too many units, trying to squeeze them in? Because we're having, parking's a real issue in this town. It's becoming one. And they had some parking spaces there, but we know that's not going to be enough. They're not going to use them, right? Some people will, but they're going to park on the street. Even with the red sidewalks, they're going to park on the street. So I fear that we're cramming too much into one.
The floodgates are already, there's no reversing course, really. The state, we have mandates from the state, and those are not going to stop. There's a housing crisis that we have. I'm not defending the design at all, but making things less dense is just not, it won't be legally supportable. It just, on many levels. I think what we can do is to try to deal with this kind of how do we create communities within those confines And maybe there are tweaks to our code that can make that better, and that my belief is some of this is regarding like usable areas. I mean, and like that helps to define that better, still giving them people opportunities to do everything else that's allowed in the code. But change is hard. I mean, it just is. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I mean, it's R2 and it's zoned that way. And I think a lot of people aren't aware what their adjacent property is zoned. They just aren't. And they probably should be more so, but there's, especially in Oregon, it's clear and objective standards. There's really, that's it. If it's, if it's not in the code, it's really, I mean, and we can't put arbitrary things in the code. Now, on these items for PUDs that we're addressing, and to the extent that we have this open space element in our condominium provisions, there is some discretion, and it's by this body, and in particular PUDs have that. They always have. Now, cottage clusters are different in that they're state template-driven processes in their middle housing. PUDs are more discretionary. So depending on the process, there is more discretion. I think that what I'd like to do is continue the dialogue on the usable open space. But some of this is we're maturing as a city. There's like, and housing needs analysis really articulates it, and there's just not housing that's affordable. So what can we do to create the best we can with the situation? And I'm going to continue with my conversation here and this PowerPoint on examples that you probably like even less. And these are state model. We haven't got there, but these are state model things. So I'm trying to deal with stuff we can control that the state hasn't preempted us in that process. And that's the part we can control. But we really, I know it's hard. People get emotional and like their communities are changing. And I get that. And it's not that I'm not, compassionate about that. But it's like we have parameters around what's required. And, so this body in particular, I want to use as that, sounding board to say, is there something beyond, usable open space that we can be doing? Because I don't think we can tweak with the density pieces of this, but my goal is to encourage things that we'd like to do more of, or maybe we like better than the opposite of that. And I haven't quite got to those examples tonight, but you're going to get some examples that you're going to like, I believe, even less than what we were talking about.
Okay.
I guess one last thing. Just as we move forward here, I'm having trouble too with the average salary people are making in this area. $450,000 is not that hard of a loan for two people making $80,000 a year. And I think most homes have two income earners in it. We don't know. I don't think that study was part of that. But to be realistic as we move through this is we're not talking about just somebody with $80,000 moving into this. You're probably talking two earners. And $450,000 is not that far of a reach for that.
Okay.
I just keep in the back of my mind.
No, and I just maybe one comment. I mean, the housing needs we've looked at the consultants have looked at the demographics, and it's still a big lift. Really, we're trying to deal with the issue of entry level homes, and that's kind of and not just entry level, but that would be ideal. And salaries have not kept up. That's another reality as well. They just have not, our history, where you got a job and the house was worth three times your salary or your combined salary with your significant other, those days are over. And that ratio now is like probably well over 10. To the ratio of what you make to what the home is worth. It's in the average situation. So,
Okay. Judy, have you got anything for us?
I do. Thank you. I have one quick question. I step back and look at this about defining open space for PUDs, and I really agree, Don, with what you're saying about allowing the developers to have that trade-off so that we can encourage some of this. But when we've looked at some of the PUD examples for other areas, they were larger. They had combinations of homes and townhouses and vice versa. And I'm trying to wrap my head around where do we have left in the city limits And/or if we're not going to add a lot to the growth boundary for residential, I mean, do we have anything left that would have a PUD that might have a private park or a sports field or viewpoints? Do we have any property left like that?
There's some, Commissioner Juris, there's some on the south end of the city not already brought into the urban growth boundary,
Okay.
and there's some in special area J, but I agree with your sentiments. Again, that's why we're going through this very granular buildable lands analysis. Not to say that we want, without, justification and expansion, but there just is not much, there's not, in my opinion, that much land left. I mean, and we're talking 20 years and 6,000 people, so it's like, that's hard for me to wrap my head around a little bit, but we're going through that exercise. Now, there are some examples that clearly, special area J in the south end of town, clearly could be PUDs. And so what I'm trying to look at here is incentivize that in the sense of like, here's your standard option, this is, what you could do as a standard option. And even larger lot developers that with executive homes are backing off because people aren't affording those, and they're contemplating different product types. It's an interesting time that we're in right now. So just like, how do we incentivize something that actually builds community and creates what we want out of that? That's really the focus I'm looking at.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay,
I've got a few more slides, but yeah, just,
yes,
yeah.
anybody, anything, you guys, anything?
Not right now.
The only thing I would say is, have we thought about if we've got open space and recreation land, if somebody wants to come in and put something like this in, that's within a suitable walking distance, that maybe they could, the Parks and Recs puts us in a really, really bad situation where this is concerned, because I believe that there's probably developers that are out there that says, sure, we'll give you this spot, this open area, this recreation area, you can do with it what you want. But the cities, no, we don't want it. We don't want to take care of it. We don't want it. We don't want it. So that puts us in a hard situation where that's concerned, because we're basically encouraging the developers to just develop every inch of it that they can, which they don't have a problem doing. So I'd like to see what we've talked about here tonight, but maybe look at some kind of a sliding scale where if they're within a certain distance of public area, school ball fields, whatever, that rather than doing these little bits and pieces in people's backyards and side yards and everything else, that there would be some way that they could attain it and make this thing work because they're within a workable, something that the city is.
Within proximity.
Yeah.
And maybe a good example of that is if you have adjacency to like the Emerald Necklace, and again, that would be probably needed to be fairly close to that, and there was a park facility there, I think that makes total sense. And some of this is a council directive and some of this is Parks Board, and I'm not trying to get crosswise with anybody here in the city, but you're asking really good questions about that. But I see some synergies if there's proximity.
Yeah.
And we're, hey, you can ride your bike on the Emerald Necklace, but there's an adjacent piece of land to it that also could connect to the bike trail or, whatever that is.
Right.
There aren't that many situations like that, but I do agree with you philosophically. We do have a fairly rigorous dedication matrix. There's 12 items, criteria that you have to meet. So it's not a small justification for us to take it in and give the parks SDC credits for that based on the land. So that is a little complicated. We will be getting back into it, I believe, though, as we have less and less land and people that are the remaining pieces of the Emerald Necklace come in. That will happen, and that conversation for sure along the trail connection along that loops everything else all in is, in my opinion, not an issue, but the adjacent pieces of it is a good question.
Yeah, and then the only other thing is that in this verbiage here that you have, that maybe we would include something to where if they do it, that because of what the Parks and Rec says, that the HOAs definitely take care of those areas, and the HOAs have to stay functional and so on and so forth, however that looks.
And I think that is something we've seen that in some developments where they really don't want the city involved because they believe that they'll take care of it better. I mean, that's really where,
And
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah.
I have no problem with that, but we just need to, if we get that open space and we get that place that we're talking about, that it's maintained. If they don't want the city to do it, then they need to do it, so.
Yep.
Okay, anything else, people?
so we're, a couple more slides, Laney, next slide. So jumping back to House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458, and just a little context here. House Bill 2001, these are both 2 or 3 years old. House Bill 2001 allows a duplex on any single-family residential property in the city. So you can have 2 houses on 1 lot anywhere in the city, attached or detached. Senate Bill 458 went further with that and said that you could have 2 houses with a 0 lot line between the 2 of them, and you could further subdivide those properties down. And so the example would be 7,000 square foot lots in R1 zone property, redivided to 3,500 square feet with a common wall lot line on the two units, whether it's a duplex or townhome style. The 7,000 square foot R1 lots would go through a planning process through the Planning Commission. You'd have authority over that. You would not have authority over the subsequent 3,500 square foot lot redivision of that. That's protected by Senate Bill 458. And this is, go ahead.
I was under the impression that the law was that any place where can be allowed, any place in R1 that was suitable under Canby law to build a duplex, it had to be allowed or something like that. Is it?
That's correct. So R1 and R15, and R15 is not going to be as big of an issue because there's a minimum density and you're already allowed attached product type. And we're not seeing that necessarily as big of an issue, but in R1, any single-family residential, low-density residential lot could have a duplex on it. Now, we've not seen a lot of this since this legislation's been. We maybe get 1 or 2 a year, and
So the 12,000 square foot rule doesn't, because I think Canby has a rule that you have to be over 12,000 square
that's
feet.
preempted. Yeah,
That's preempted by this.
because if it's over, if you had 7,000 square feet, you can, because that's the minimum size in R1, you can redivide that lot. Now, we have received some interest recently, and we're not sure where this is going to go, just full disclosure, that people are interested in doing this in Canby. And this is, we're probably a little behind where other jurisdictions are. I know West Lynn has already been through some of this, our adjacent neighbor. But just to let you know that, this is something that is the law now that's preempted by the state. And somebody could actually do the same thing in R15 and redivide it. I see that for 5,000 square foot lot into 2,500 square foot lots. I see that less of an issue because I think R15, the density, you can go up to 13. And so you probably are going to do a different product type to begin with. But in R1, just to make folks aware of that, that's kind of where things are at the state level. Now, this for me is why, we can't really do a lot about this. Neighbors are still going to get noticed, and there's theoretically an appeal process, but none of those standards would hold up unless they were inconsistent with the state law. So this is something we've not seen a lot of, but in my view, this is kind of the spectrum of like, what can we control on other sections of our code to try to do more community development. I don't see this necessarily as being a community development exercise, it's more of a density exercise, which, but again, preempted by the state. There is new legislation. There's 67 pages the governor's in the session right now is going through. I hope to report back on our next work session. I signed up for a OAPA, I just saw it on LinkedIn yesterday. There's a free webinar on Wednesday. And I'm going to try to get more information on what this all means, the 67 pages. A lot of it's about metro jurisdictions, so we are not, that doesn't apply to us, but there's other things that do apply. I don't think that the urban growth boundary expansion exception, 75 acres, the governor's proposing, will end up making a difference for Canby in that we don't have more excessive burden percentage for rent than the state percentage. We have less than that, and I think you have to have more than the state to have that. But essentially, 75 acres, you could do an urban growth boundary expansion without having to do a buildable lands analysis, as long as 30% of the area was at 80% median family income. But you would have to show that you had more than the state's percentage of excessive, those that were excessive rent burdened. So this is just, again, not to throw this out there to scare people at all, but in context of what we can control, this is kind of where I'm at, and I'm always about trying to incentivize where we have the prerogative to, well, you could do this, or you could do this. And, choice is good if we can provide that.
So to paraphrase, is it House Bill 2001 that applies to both the R1 and R5 divisions?
It does.
Okay, so any R1 lot that is a minimum of 7,000 square feet can be divided up as many times as it needs to into 3,500 square feet lots?
Well, let me back up. So 2001 allows a duplex on any single family. Well, it really is more the R1 zone as 2001. So in R1, any single family lot can have two houses on it. That's the law right now.
Gotcha.
And the parameters are that second home needs to meet all the residential standards of the base zone, with one exception, which is the rear lot. I think ours is 5 feet more on the rear than what the state law says. But that's the law. And then Senate Bill 458 says in an R1, and it would apply to R15 as well, that if you had a duplex on a property, let's say you created 7,000 square foot lots, you could then go back and do 3,500 square foot lots with a common wall that would be zero lot line between the two units. The other lot lines would meet the setbacks that are in the base zone, but there'd be a common, so you'd end up with two 3,500 square foot units on the same area that you platted that was 7,000 square feet. So you double the density.
So this is allowing for that to continue to be split on land that has not yet been built? Or is this only building more on an existing lot?
You'd have a subdivision, visualize a subdivision and getting approved, 7,000 square foot lots, and then those lots being divided yet again through the Senate Bill 458 process, which is administrative.
Gotcha.
It would not go to this body. I cannot take it through this body. We're preempted from that. So just in context again, the other things start to look a lot better. Cottage developments, planning developments, when you start looking at what the state has provided, not just in the state, but I think in terms of community building, I think those other options are better in my opinion.
When we're talking about meeting all other underlying zone requirements, would that then be, if we're talking about having PUDs or any kind of multi-unit whatevers that we are saying there needs to be some kind of open space available, would that be wrapped into the underlying zone requirements?
It would, if you were going to do a straight up subdivision with House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458, you would not have to be subject yourself to PUD. If that's a voluntary process, you can choose to just use the state law to do that.
Okay.
And then our, just to follow with what you're saying, our requirements for open space and so on and so forth.
They would not apply. And so what I'm saying, and this might apply to larger acreages. So do we have some other ability to say there's some other tool that we will create that would be as enticing perhaps, or maybe better for the developer and for this community that we could offer than to go with the standard state provisions that we have in place?
And then I also remember you saying that with this, what is it, I think it was 458, one of the two where you have a duplex, that you have to allow on-street parking and you don't have to have any off-street parking.
No off-street parking is required, and actually you could, I'm not sure what the market is. This will be interesting to see what happens here. Like, I'm sure there'll still be a garage, but theoretically you could have one, with the split, the 7,000 square foot lot and two 3,500 units, you could take the driveway right down the middle and you could have one space for one house. That would be permissible, completely permissible.
So could we have something that would be, and I'm just having thoughts here, could we have something to where we would have no on-street parking, but if you decided to do that, that you would need to supply a dozen parking spots like in that last development that we had where they had?
There's preemptive. We can't require any additional standards beyond the current code. So, whatever R1 and R15 require for driveways, that's it. That's all we can require. And that's
Okay.
So the driveway requirements would stay in effect?
they would, but
So you have to
but
be
you'd
12
end
feet
up with.
wide and 15 or so
You
deep,
could have-
15 or 20 deep?
Yeah, but you would have half of that because it's one, the state law only requires one space per unit. But I mean, it depends on how they're designed. You may end up having a developer because a lot of people drive and it's probably a necessity here in Canby to have a car, especially, unless you live and work in Canby. But the law only requires one space one driveway space per unit.
So given that we're not part of Metro and that it would be pretty easy to come up with data that shows that people who live in Canby do not work in Canby, I mean, it'd be pretty easy to just come up with like how many cars are registered to homes in Canby. I mean, the DMV can provide that. I mean, we've got a higher than average number because most people need cars to get to work. I mean, would that be a basis for contesting any level of this? Because, I mean, it seems.
It's the state.
You're not really serving
yeah.
anybody if people can't park near their house.
I don't disagree, and that's why I'm just providing this as a comparison. I mean, it's not ideal taking away local control over things that probably, in my opinion, are better handled with local control, but given the housing crisis, this is the direction the governor's gone.
Okay, so I guess we would give you direction to come up with some type of a product that would save us, okay?
Okay, that's
From
well, an option, and this is going to be a continuing dialogue on what we're dealing with, but I mean, this is kind of where we're going. I mean, if we don't do anything, this is it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you going to explain the fine that came up when this fine gentleman was off on an island? And I think what it had to do with, you had to have a paperwork option that paralleled any special requirements that you might have for, say, a planned unit development. And it was kind of out of context, and I think that I didn't quite get that as it applies.
Say that.
We were listing some consultants, and essentially what they said is that there is a state law that anything that you allowed, like say through a PUD, through running it through us, there also had to be available a paperwork only option available to everyone.
And I think there needs to be, this is make it more complicated. So PUDs are discretionary. So the base zone requirements, like option A, option B, that was not completely correct, what was said. I mean, there's in a PUD option, you can you can go that route and be subject to more discretionary standards, or you could just go ahead and do a regular subdivision. Those are your option. For cottage cluster, that is a middle housing type, which has to follow the middle housing model code of the state. So that one does differ a little bit in the sense that has less discretion in it because it needs to follow the model code. There's always the option to go back to the base zone. So the base zone in R1 and R15 will probably always exist, and you will be able to develop according to those codes. Or you could do a cottage cluster or a PUD, and then we have this third option, which is what the state is offering, which ironically is another option, not in our code necessarily codified, but it's there because of the state law. We do have a general code section that addresses the model ordinance, but those are the examples. So, and the PUDs can be discretionary. PUDs can be a type 3, which is the planning commission. They typically are. Cottage clusters are typically not type 3. That could be type 3 if that was the decision of the council and the planning commission. We are somewhat at risk in that it is a middle housing type, and we could be subject to a lawsuit because if we're applying discretionary standards to that cottage cluster that are not supposed to be there, and it ends up being denied, that could be a basis of a suit. Hopefully that helps, but it's a little confusing. But the bottom line is we have to provide, we can't preclude like your base zone options, and then some of these like middle housing, when you get into that specific category, we can't really alter that process, but the PUD process is really wide open. And the state sees that as quite discretionary. And they're not necessarily like thinking that's really great because anytime discretion's involved, they believe price is involved as well. I'm not 100% convinced that those go in tandem. I think it depends on how you develop your code. But PUDs are thought to be more exclusive living environments typically and more discretionary in their nature. I like them because they do provide both attached and detached product. But the density piece I want to revisit with the Planning Commission as we walk through this, because I do feel like you need to at least be able to transfer the density, and it's probably why we haven't seen a PUD in over 10 years, is my guess, is because people are like, why in the world would I ever do this?
Okay.
And again, when I can do this.
Yeah.
It's
That
like-
sounds different
yeah.
than the way that it was coming out of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that we subsequently, I've talked to our council on this as well, and they were pretty clear about what those lines were, so,
Okay.
yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
You got more?
Laney, is there one more slide? Yeah, this is again what I just said, basically, just again, I think that's really the heart of this, is trying to maintain our control. And Laney, I think there's one last slide. And then that other slide, please. So that's it. And then I'm ready to wrap it up, and we can talk more on February 26th. If you would like me to bring anything back on February 26th, we will have some hearings coming up. They probably won't be until like April. There's a bunch of stuff in the hopper, but it hasn't materialized completely.
So something I don't fully understand about the PUDs and the options that they would offer versus the state mandated paths for R1 and R.5. What would make any developer, who they are generally profit focused and therefore want the density to the maximum amount possible, why would they consider anything other than the max density that the state's allowing? Like, what would make anything else appealing to them?
I mean, I think there's a period of time we're going through right now. I mean, I feel like there's an adjustment happening on the recognition that traditional, two-story units, large houses on large lots are not working. I don't know if that has gone as far as like the state example, where that's like the most lucrative way for a developer to actually build. And I believe that is probably more of a niche market for developers. I don't believe a lot of housing developers are doing the entire variety of products yet. I think they're trying to figure out what they want to do. And if they can provide a product mix of types that still are not all necessarily abutting each other, like the state example, and still make a reasonable profit, I think there isn't a way to incentivize that. And again, I think only speaking from those that we've talked to here that are interested in the PUD and cottage cluster, and they've built other things in this community. They're not looking at like, hey, let's use the model ordinance. That conversation is not part of what's happened. So they're looking at like, hey, we want to build more of a community. We don't just want to like maximize density. So I do believe there's still developers out there, and there's been people that in this community that historically have built exclusive subdivisions, and they have been like, looking at what do cottage clusters do, and I've had some conversations with them, and they're not like necessarily going that direction, but the fact they're even asking the question is, 2 years ago, they would not even ask the question. I mean, so it's like that. I think there's an evolution in the industry. So I don't think more dense, tighter compact necessarily is advantageous for all developers, would be my answer. And so by providing that variety, I think it doesn't hurt to have tools, and I think we only provide incentives for people to do things that are unique by providing those incentives. If we don't provide any incentives, nobody's going to do anything. And so, but I do feel like I think the industry is trying to figure out where it's going right now. I mean, and the market, interest rates will hopefully help when they fall. I mean, I'm hoping they'll fall more, but, we kind of hit a cliff last July when they elevated them 11 times and there was no development whatsoever. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens like with the interest rates coming down, and then like how those market types are, but there clearly is interest in cottage clusters and in PUDs and some of the housing developers in this community.
Thank you.
The only input I would have on the whole cottage cluster thing is I would like to see us keep our R1 intact, our R1.5 intact. And if somebody wants to do a cottage cluster, then have that be its own entity. So you could do like a 1.5, and if you want to do a cottage cluster within that, then this is kind of what it needs to look like. This is what we'd like to see, type of a thing. But if they're interested in doing that kind of a product, we need to try to get ahead of it and at least have it in place. So if they say, we want to build a cottage cluster, then this is kind of what we'd like to see it look like. So that's all.
And there's going to be more on that and more specifics about what, because I think a lot of this we kind of threw a lot at you, and like you read the text and you're like, what does this mean? Like, and I'm like even reading it and saying like, I kind of get it, but like, what does this physically look like? So that's part of that discussion is like, I want you to say, okay, here's what the text says. This is what it looks like. But again, I'm in comparison to the state preemptive standards, I think that still looks favorable in light of that.
Anything else?
That was it. Yeah, I'm ready to go into planning director updates, and I'll be quick on that.
Okay, then I am going to bring this work session to a close. And thank you, Dawn, for all of that and for all of your input, commissioners. And then we'll go into items of interest, report from the planning staff.
Thank you, Commissioner Ewert. Just again, I'm repeating a little bit here, but we'll have another work session on February 26th, continuing this discussion. I should have more information from DLCD at that point on buildable lands information. And then I'll have a better idea of it'll at least be a council work session I'm planning sometime March, April to bring them up to speed. I might include all of you as well. Haven't quite figured that out yet. That's going to lead into the housing needs analysis and housing production strategy hearings that will be happening subsequently. That needs to get figured out before we do any more long-range planning on community summits, because we need to know the acreage on residential. We know the acreage on employment for what that is forecasted. That's critical for all the things we're doing on the housing demand. Is that's the next step, is to figure that out, and then we'll do another summit. Probably May, June, community summit. There'll be another listening session with those folks that are in the outside of the urban growth boundary, where they're in the study area. So that's all kind of coming forward. We're still moving forward with everything, but this kind of slight pause here And I just, again, wanted to take advantage of like going back through our code, trying to update our code and realizing like, I can't just put a Band-Aid on this thing and do efficiency measures and then have a bunch of inconsistencies with the code. It needs to holistically be kind of addressed. But there may be still sections that don't quite get addressed, but it just felt like we needed to take a little bit of a pause on that anyway. And then that's going to lead us into the next discussions. I'll keep you updated on things, and then I'll obviously on, hearing items will get mixed in. I think fencing is going to come back, fencing code in March. I know you guys are probably not thrilled about that, but March 25th. So that's coming back. So some fencing code discussions. So
I'm really excited about that. I'm excited to dig into it. I'm really looking
I
forward to it.
saw a few
actually.
people wince when I said that, but that was it for me. Okay.
Judy is.
Code enforcement chains.
Okay.
Will we be able,
Anything else? Don?
No.
will we be able to work a definition of common space or the alleyway definitions in at some point?
So dealing with fencing or in
Oh,
just
no,
in
not
general?
specific to fencing,
Yeah.
but just kind of like in the spirit of some of the things we're working on. So we were talking about open space in the slide deck today, but then there's also common space that apparently we need to define, that perhaps we could wrap up with that. And then we had a discussion about what is an alleyway, what is a road a few months back that I think would be valuable to define as
And,
well.
and that's going to be part of more so the transportation system plan update when we get into that issue. And
Okay.
alleys are challenging, to be honest with you, because are they public? Are they private? Are they really kind of a driveway, or do we own them as a city or not? And if we could peel that part back before we dive in, I don't really want to mix it into the open space discussion necessarily, but
Oh, sure.
but
No, that's just
defining-
kind of check boxes,
Yeah.
not necessarily a.
But it is not off the radar screen, and I think as we see more and more development, it's going to become more of a challenge for
And that's
us,
my
because I
concern.
think our code is not well written in that section either, and it needs some help. I mean, we need to figure out, how we're dealing with those.
Do we have a definition section of the code?
There isn't,
Refer to.
it's like the second or third, if you go to the code sections, there's definitions. That's another section of the code that needs to be updated substantially. There just aren't very many definitions, and I find that a lot of what would be critical words, if you're looking at like what these mean, are not there. So we have to go to a common definition, which is usually Webster or practice in terms of how we apply that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be worth looking at that at some point, because we talk about, well, we have so much code that needs to be revised, and that's definitely true. But perhaps if we were able to knock out some of these common definitions that are tripping us up on things where we do have some say, we could save ourselves a bit of heartache.
And I'm not trying to push this out at all. We just have a ton of things on the plate with the comp plan and the transportation system plan and urban growth boundary. I mean, but that is the focus still. I want to recognize that we do need to update the code. We'll need consultants to update the entire code. It's probably been 25 years since that's been written. But holistically, and that would be Public Works as well. It's not just our code, but it would be all the Public Works standards as well. And so that would be kind of the goal, is to get through the comp plan and then start to put in for requests for proposal for the code update holistically after we're done with the comp plan. And some of that is related to the comp plan needing to direct policies as well. So like, we're clear on where we should be changing the code.
It seems to me like when you folks have gotten all of these applications before you and everything else, that you could pick out 10 low-hanging fruit, simple code things that we could just get taken care of.
Didn't we just do that?
We have done that, yeah, recent, I mean, you're.
I'd like to see
Yeah.
that continue to go
Yeah,
on, though. I think
okay.
it kind of died away.
Yeah.
It's a bigger ladder.
Yeah. And so I agree.
Okay.
So I just think.
But I
that
know,
would
I
be-
mean, to your point, I mean, the revelation on that residential stuff, I mean, I was just like, I was looking at this for this presentation, diving into our code and like, what in the world? I mean, these are the moments that you don't want to have when you're reading your own code.
Right.
It's like, this is like, you start to understand like what the weaknesses of it is, and not necessarily from development standards, but just like in practice, like, are we trying to incentivize, areas of open space that around with houses around it, or are we just not, people are like, I can't understand it, or it doesn't do me any good, so I'm not going to even go there.
Well, I just think that, whether it's Brianna or any of our planners,
Yep.
and they have somebody that brings a project to them, and they're putting together, they're looking at it, and they think, this is goofy. There's a black hole here in our code. If that could be taken, and you guys could bring it to us and say, this is the problem. This is what we think the fix is. If you agree, let's fix it. Box check. And move on. And I think, I think we could eat the elephant in small bites as we move along would be a good thing.
And I will make that part of our to-do list.
Okay.
I had one other question,
Yep.
and that's just kind of in general an awareness piece. So I got a notice in the mail from Metro today. I don't know if any of you guys did.
I did as well.
If you make $150,000 as an individual or more than $200,000 as a household, you're subject to a 1% tax paid to Metro. It includes Clackamas County, not just like Metro proper that I was thinking of, and it's kind of to help with homelessness services and other like community services. It wasn't something I was aware of prior to this notice in my mailbox. I was surprised to get something that said I needed to pay some money to Metro. And is that something you guys have any awareness of?
We don't, and there probably does need to be better communication. It's a little reminiscent of the discussions, not on a taxation basis, but with Clackamas County saying that Metro was looking at adjusting the Metro boundaries, and caused us a little bit of a concern, which dissipated by talking to the planning director at Metro and saying, no, you guys are never going to be in Metro, but that was related to transportation classifications of roadways, federal classifications of roadways, which gives us the ability to tap into federal money. So I think the one thing we probably should be doing is making more connectional points with Metro in particular, so we're not like, I can't speak to the issue you got in the mail, but just so that like there's a line of communication and not just getting a piece of, mail and like knowing about that in advance. I know sometimes the papers pick that stuff up, but yeah, I was not aware of that, and I think a lot of times, things happen, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the metro area, but I think that's, and I can talk to Eileen about that, our administrator, about like, are there connection points we have where like, as we start to continue, what are the other things that we might be hearing about?
Yeah, or just how, Metro in some ways is apparently affecting us. Because, the last thing I expected was a personally addressed notice being like, hey, you owe us a couple $1,000s. Like, oh, cool. Glad to know about that.
That's to pay off the 250 acres they bought just on our southwest border.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything? Judy?
No, thank you. Excellent presentation, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
All right. With that being said, I guess we'll go into adjournment. I need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those
Aye.
opposed? Good night, Canby. Thank you for sticking with us.
Thank you.